It was a quiet morning on the ranch, the kind of morning that makes a person feel like they own the world, or at least the stretch of land beneath their boots. The sun had just begun its slow climb over the rolling hills, casting a golden glow across the pasture where cattle lazily grazed. Birds were chirping, the wind whispered through the tall grass, and the smell of fresh hay filled the air. For years, this ranch had been my sanctuary, a place where life moved at a slower pace, and the only things demanding attention were fences, livestock, and the occasional stubborn gate. I had just finished checking the east fence, running my hand along the rough wooden posts, when I noticed an unusual sight in the distance, a line of orange stakes cutting across my property, accompanied by yellow tape fluttering in the breeze. At first, I thought maybe it was a surveying crew, but as I got closer, my eyes caught the unmistakable gleam of heavy machinery. Excavators and trenchers were parked along a swath of cleared land, and workers in neon vests were measuring and marking out the terrain. My stomach sank. "What in the world are you doing on my property?" I shouted, jogging toward the group. The workers looked up, startled, but no one seemed to step forward to answer. One of them, a young guy with a hard hat slightly tilted on his head, mumbled something about an easement, and went back to his clipboard. I could feel the heat rising to my face. Easement? On my land? I didn't recall signing any easement agreements, at least not for something like this. I pulled out my phone and dialed the HOA office, my fingers trembling slightly as I paced along the edge of my pasture. A cheerful receptionist answered, followed by a manager who assured me, in a tone that dripped with patronizing calm, that this pipeline project had been approved and scheduled months ago. Approved? I repeated, incredulous. On my land? Without my permission? Well, the manager said, ignoring the emphasis in my voice, the land was considered part of a community right-of-way, so no individual consent was necessary. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Community right-of-way? My property had boundaries, deeds, and tax records. I'd been running this ranch for years, paying my dues, and no one had ever mentioned this supposed right-of-way. My initial shock gave way to a mix of frustration and disbelief. These people were literally digging trenches across my land, as if I were invisible. I stormed back toward the excavation, trying to keep my composure as I confronted the crew again. "Listen, I don't care what approvals you think you have. This is my property. Stop digging." The young man glanced nervously at his supervisor, who shrugged and muttered something about following orders. The trenching machine roared to life, and the ground trembled beneath my feet. I clenched my fists, realizing that words alone wouldn't stop this operation. Retreating to my office trailer, I pulled out the property deeds, tax records, and old business papers I'd accumulated over the years. My mind raced. How could this be happening? How could the HOA assume the right to run a pipeline through my property without even notifying me? I scanned the documents, hoping for some oversight that would explain this bizarre intrusion. Nothing. Then, a nagging thought struck me, one I had buried for years. I remembered a distant relative leaving me a stake in a utility company decades ago. Back then, I had dismissed it as a minor investment, one that barely warranted attention. Could there be a connection? Could this pipeline project, somehow, involve the very company I had forgotten I owned? The idea seemed absurd, almost comical, yet I couldn't shake it. Determined to get answers, I grabbed my truck and drove toward the nearest HOA office, my mind buzzing with questions. The quiet morning had evaporated, replaced by a storm of confusion and indignation. As I approached the office, I could see the gleam of white vans and the familiar logo plastered on the side of one. Community Utilities Services. My pulse quickened. That was the company my distant relative had left me a share in, or had it been the entire company? For the first time, the intrusion didn't feel like a simple misunderstanding. It felt like the opening scene of an absurd story that I couldn't have written if I'd tried. A pipeline was being bulldozed through my land by people who didn't know the first thing about property rights, and somehow I might be more involved than I realized. I parked my truck, grabbed the deeds, and marched into the office. The receptionist greeted me with a forced smile. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Yes," I said, trying to keep my voice calm but firm. You can help me by explaining why a pipeline is being built across my ranch without my permission, and why it involves a company I may actually own. Her smile faltered, and I could see the confusion ripple across the room. For the first time, the absurdity of the situation became clear, not just to me, but perhaps to everyone else in that office. The quiet ranch morning had spiraled into a confrontation that was only beginning, and I had a sinking suspicion that this story wasn't just about a pipeline. It was about control, ownership, and a very inconvenient irony. Little did I know, the next steps would reveal just how much power I actually held over the very project that had dared to invade my land. After storming out of the HOA office with more questions than answers, I returned to the quiet of my ranch, my mind buzzing. The construction crews were still hammering and digging across my property, oblivious to the fact that their entire project might be built on a misunderstanding, or worse, ignorance of who truly held the cards. I parked my truck under the shade of an old oak, took a deep breath, and tried to piece together what I knew. It had been years, decades really, since I'd touched the business records of my distant relative's estate. At the time, I'd inherited a minor stake in a water utility company. My assumption was simple. It was a small investment that barely mattered, probably a leftover from some long-forgotten trust or partnership. I never imagined it could still exist as a functioning business, much less supply water to an entire neighborhood. And certainly, I never expected that same company would be the one powering the HOA's pipeline project. The first step was the obvious one: paperwork. I pulled out dusty folders stacked in the corner of my office, documents that had been forgotten under years of ranch operations. There were deeds, business agreements, corporate filings, and a handful of tax papers. One by one, I sifted through them, scanning for anything that tied my name or my family's name to water supply contracts. Hours passed, dust motes dancing in the sunlight streaming through the windows as I cross-referenced old phone numbers, company addresses, and legal names. Then it hit me. My name wasn't just on the shareholder registry. I owned controlling shares. That minor inheritance had somehow morphed into a majority stake, probably due to forgotten transfers or expired claims from other shareholders. The company wasn't just functioning, it was operational, profitable, and most importantly, supplying water to the very HOA that was now bulldozing my land. My stomach sank, but it was quickly replaced by a surge of incredulous amusement. The irony was almost too perfect. The HOA was building a pipeline through my property while unknowingly relying on a company I effectively owned. I picked up the phone and called the law firm that had handled the estate years ago. After a brief explanation of the situation, their laughter over the line was unmistakable. "You're telling me the HOA is digging on your land and the water company supplying them belongs to you?" the lawyer asked, shaking his head in disbelief. "Yes," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, though the absurdity of it all made me want to laugh myself. "Apparently, I own the company, and they have no idea." The lawyer went silent for a moment before continuing. "Well, this gives you significant leverage. You might want to tread carefully, but legally, you can control what happens to that water supply." I spent the next few hours piecing together the company's structure, contracts, and obligations. The HOA's contract wasn't a generic municipal supply. It had clauses that left them completely dependent on the utility company. And since I owned the majority shares, I technically had the authority to make decisions about service, billing, and approvals. Every detail I uncovered made the situation more ridiculous and more advantageous. I also began reaching out to former accountants, business advisors, and even a retired executive who had worked at the company. Each conversation confirmed the unbelievable truth. The company had continued operating under autopilot, and I had been its silent owner all along. None of the HOA board members had ever conducted due diligence to see who controlled their water source. They were running full steam ahead, oblivious to the fact that the person they were inconveniencing and potentially infringing upon was the one holding the ultimate authority over their project. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I had a plan forming in my mind. There were a few routes I could take: legal injunctions, formal letters, or a personal confrontation. But what appealed to me most was the idea of leveraging the situation with a bit of dramatic flair. After all, How often does someone get to confront a group of bureaucrats armed not with anger alone, but with undeniable corporate authority? Still, I had to be careful. The HOA might scramble to negotiate, stall, or even try to challenge my claim. I needed evidence, clear documentation proving ownership, corporate control, and the HOA's reliance on my company. I printed out contracts, shareholder agreements, and supply records, stacking them neatly in a folder labeled Pipeline Predicament. As night fell over the ranch, the distant hum of the construction crews had quieted. I stood on a hill overlooking the property, the pipeline trench cutting a sharp line across the pasture. I couldn't help but smirk. The absurdity of the situation was almost cinematic. Here was a powerful organization, confident in its authority, unknowingly dependent on me. And the best part? They had no idea I had realized it yet. The first phase of my investigation was complete. I had the evidence, the understanding, and the leverage. Now, it was just a matter of choosing the right moment to confront the HOA and deciding just how much chaos and justice I wanted to unleash. The ranch had taught me patience, observation, and the value of standing my ground, but this was something different. This was about turning an absurd intrusion into an opportunity for empowerment, using the very tools the HOA had assumed were theirs. As I locked my office for the night, the stars twinkling over the quiet fields, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and anticipation. The next day, I would move from investigation to action. And when I did, the HOA would finally realize exactly whose land and water they had been messing with all along. The next morning, the ranch was alive with the sounds of construction, the rumble of machinery, the metallic clang of tools hitting pipe, and the occasional shouted instruction from the foreman. I watched from the edge of my property, a folder of evidence tucked under my arm, feeling a strange mix of amusement and anticipation. Today, I wasn't just the ranch owner. I was the unseen power behind the water supply keeping this entire HOA operation running. And it was time they realized it. I drove my truck down the dirt path leading to the construction site, making sure it was visible enough to grab attention but not so close as to provoke immediate hostility. The crew paused as I approached, their expressions a mix of curiosity and irritation. I waved casually, holding the folder like a shield of authority. "Morning," I called out, trying to keep my tone light but firm. "I think we need to have a little chat about this project." The foreman frowned. "Sir, we've got approvals. The HOA said we could proceed." "Yes, approvals," I said, holding up the folder. "From the HOA. Not from me. And here's the thing, they're also relying on my company for the water that runs through this entire pipeline. Did anyone check who actually owns the supply?" The silence that followed was almost cinematic. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, and even the foreman's confident posture faltered. Some of them whispered to each other, a subtle recognition that maybe the situation wasn't as straightforward as they'd thought. "Wait, what do you mean?" the foreman asked, scratching his head. I stepped forward, calm and deliberate, and laid out the facts. I inherited a controlling stake in the water company that provides service to this HOA. In other words, you're building a pipeline across my property, on land I own, while relying on a company I effectively control. Every drop of water flowing through this project is coming from me. And yet no one thought to ask permission, or even check the ownership records. The reactions were priceless. One worker literally stopped mid-shovel, staring at me like I'd grown horns. Another whispered into a phone, presumably calling someone at the HOA, while the foreman paled. I could almost hear the mental gears turning as the reality of the situation sank in. This wasn't just a property dispute. It was a power reversal the HOA had never anticipated. Within minutes, an HOA official arrived, huffing and looking flustered. "Sir, you can't just," he started, before I held up my hand. "Actually," I interrupted. "I can. And legally, I do. The land belongs to me. The water belongs to my company. And yet here you are, bulldozing across my pasture like I don't exist. So, let's figure this out before anyone makes a mistake." I could see the color drain from his face. He muttered something about oversight and miscommunication, but it was clear he had no real answers. My advantage was complete, and I made sure to savor it. There was no yelling, no threats, just a calm, undeniable authority backed by documentation, contracts, and corporate control. Pulling out the folder, I presented the HOA with clear evidence, shareholder agreements, company records, supply contracts, and legal papers proving my control of the water company. Their faces went from confusion to panic in record time. Phones were pulled out, calls were made, and frantic whispers filled the air. It was surreal. This bureaucratic body that had so confidently acted as if they were in charge was now scrambling, powerless against the very person whose company they depended on. "I'm more than happy to let this project proceed," I said, "but under terms that respect my property rights and the fact that I control the water supply. Perhaps we reroute the pipeline, adjust the construction schedule, and discuss compensation for the inconvenience." The HOA officials muttered among themselves, clearly weighing the absurdity of the situation against the potential consequences. They had no choice. I held all the cards. The pipeline might still get built, but on my terms, not theirs. Even the construction crew seemed to sense the shift in authority. Orders that had flowed smoothly before now came with hesitancy, as if each shovel of dirt moved was being weighed against the unspoken truth. "We are all beholden to this person." Finally, the HOA official cleared his throat. "We understand. We'll review your proposal and get back to you." "Take your time," I said with a small smile. "But remember, every day that pipeline is under construction without proper authorization, you're technically violating my property rights, and I can assure you, my company has ways of making that very inconvenient." As I walked back toward my truck, I felt an unexpected thrill. The confrontation had been more than I could have hoped for. I hadn't had to yell, threaten, or call the police. The HOA's own reliance on my company had done all the work for me. The power dynamics had shifted completely, and now they were scrambling to adjust. Standing on the hill overlooking my ranch, the trench cutting a jagged line through the pasture, I allowed myself a chuckle. They thought they could bulldoze through my land with impunity. They thought they were in charge. And now, thanks to a forgotten inheritance and a little patience, I had turned the tables completely. The pipeline could still exist, but it would exist on my terms. The HOA had learned a valuable lesson. When you underestimate the person you are inconveniencing, the consequences can be unexpectedly ironic. And I, for one, was ready to enjoy every moment of that irony. By the following morning, the atmosphere around the ranch had shifted dramatically. The construction crews moved slowly, almost cautiously, as if every shovel of dirt might trigger some unseen consequence. Word had traveled fast within the HOA. The person whose land they were bulldozing also controlled the water supply they depended on. It was an absurd situation, but now it was very real, and no one wanted to test its limits. I arrived early, not to intimidate, but to observe. The foreman approached hesitantly, holding a clipboard and wearing a sheepish expression. "Sir, the HOA has agreed to review your proposed changes," he said, "and they want to make sure everything aligns with your property rights and company control before continuing." I nodded, offering a calm, collected smile. "Good. Let's make sure this pipeline respects the land and the proper channels of authority. I don't want unnecessary complications for anyone, though I do expect cooperation moving forward." It was a rare moment where bureaucracy met reality, and the HOA had no choice but to comply. Lawyers were called, contracts reviewed, and rerouting plans drafted. In the end, the pipeline was adjusted to avoid sensitive areas of my property, timelines were modified to account for proper permissions, and compensation was agreed upon for the intrusion already made. The HOA had learned, albeit the hard way, that ignoring property rights and corporate connections could lead to embarrassment at best and legal consequences at worst. Standing atop the hill overlooking the ranch, I took in the landscape. The trench still cut across the pasture, but now it did so under terms I had negotiated. The cows grazed peacefully nearby, unaware that a subtle but profound victory had just been achieved. I felt a mixture of satisfaction and amusement. This wasn't just about stopping a pipeline. It was about asserting control, proving authority, and most importantly, showing that knowledge and patience could turn even an absurd situation into a strategic advantage. There was a humor to the entire ordeal that I couldn't ignore. The HOA, confident and officious, had operated under the assumption that they were untouchable. Yet their dependence on the very company I owned rendered them powerless in an instant. Watching the officials scurry to make adjustments, trying to maintain dignity while realizing just how thoroughly they had miscalculated, I had to stifle laughter more than once. It was a moment of pure irony, and one I intended to savor. As the day went on, I walked the property, inspecting the rerouted trench and the areas that had been most affected. The construction crews followed instructions meticulously, occasionally glancing my way for confirmation, a silent acknowledgement of the new hierarchy. Even the HOA board members who had shown up were cautious, offering polite nods and tentative apologies. The dynamic had shifted. The tables had turned. I took a quiet moment near the old oak tree, reflecting on the absurd chain of events. A forgotten inheritance, a distant stake in a utility company, and a pipeline that dared to cross my land had combined to create a perfect storm. The irony wasn't lost on me. The organization that had once assumed authority over my property was now negotiating with me, fully aware that their water, and by extension, the success of their project, depended entirely on my goodwill. Humor aside, there was a lesson in all this. Authority without understanding is fragile. Assumptions without research are dangerous. And perhaps most importantly, sometimes the most powerful leverage comes from the quiet, overlooked details, an old inheritance, a minor stake, a forgotten document. The HOA had learned this the hard way, but I would remember it forever. By evening, the ranch had returned to a semblance of normalcy. The machines had quieted, and the crews were winding down for the day. I leaned on the fence, looking out over my land as the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. It was peaceful again, but now with the satisfaction that order had been restored, not through anger, but through clever observation and decisive action. A faint chuckle escaped me as I thought about the HOA's scramble, emails, meetings, and awkward phone calls, all to accommodate a landowner they had once overlooked. I could almost picture them tiptoeing around future projects, checking contracts, and double-checking ownership before assuming authority. The absurdity of it all lingered like a sweet aftertaste, a reminder that life sometimes offers poetic justice in the most unexpected forms. As night fell, the ranch settled into its quiet rhythm. Stars twinkled overhead, and the soft rustling of the wind through the grass was the only sound. I felt a profound sense of pride, not just in the land, but in how the situation had unfolded. A pipeline had crossed my ranch, bureaucracy had underestimated me, and yet in the end, I had turned it into a victory that was both strategic and satisfying. And so, the story closed with the land intact, the pipeline properly rerouted, and the HOA finally aware that authority, without awareness, is a fragile thing. For me, it was a reminder that sometimes patience, observation, and a touch of irony can make even the most absurd intrusion into a triumph. The ranch was mine, the water was mine, and the lesson was clear. Never underestimate the quiet power of knowing exactly what you own and how to use it.